The next item is going to be a legislative update, and Deputy Secretary Sims is going to give that, followed by the photo ID outreach update.
Madam Secretary, members of the board, I'll have as brief of a briefing as you would like, or explain as much as you'd like, but on the federal legislative front, H.R. 811 still is a bad bill. In fact, it's probably gotten worse since our last state election board meeting. Some changes were made in the legislation as a quote-unquote compromise with the House leadership to change the language in the bill so that only 5 or 6 states would be required to comply with the mandates for verified paper audit trail for the 2008 elections. Georgia would be one of them, as would be Louisiana and Maryland, all 3 of whom utilize the same DRE touchscreen systems. The real problem or concern with the state of Georgia is that we would be required to comply with the 2008 mandate, and there is a second additional mandate, in essence, for the rest of the country that Georgia would then have to comply with, as well as the other states, by 2010 or 2012. So that bill is still being discussed.
And so just for clarity, that would mean if this bill were to pass, purchasing one set of machines to meet 08 and another set of machines to purchase the future,
potentially,
to meet
yes.
future.
Unless Georgia would be able to procure machines to comply with the further out mandates and requirements within the next calendar year, and that everything would be okay going forward. And that's a big question. There's a debate among many of the states of whether or not any of the current existing systems in use today would comply with the second set of mandates. Within the past week or so, 12 national organizations, including National Governors Association, National Secretaries of State, NCSL, Council of State Governments, Conference of U.S. Mayors, and others, sent a joint letter to Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Hoyer expressing their opposition for having the bill come forward to the Rules Committee and imploring the leadership to, in essence, take a step back and allow states and secretaries of state and elections officials to participate in making some changes in the language. That bill, as a result of that, they have pulled back from the floor scheduled consideration of that bill, and there's discussions now with the leadership and trying to maneuver through some of these issues. We do not, from the national folks, there's not an expectation this bill would even be considered in the next couple of weeks, just because there appears to be a lack of votes in the House of Representatives to pass the bill as it's currently written.
Is pending, ma'am?
Yeah.
Is pending floor vote cleared all this committee?
Technically, it's come out of the House Administration Committee and is in rules. There is the ability in the Rules Committee to consider a Rules Committee amendment, which is where these types of changes would occur. There was some consideration as it was coming to rules that the sponsors of the bill would bring it forward under a closed rule, which would restrict any ability to make amendments from the floor. As a reaction to that, the Rules Committee received 20 or 30 amendments proposed in the Rules Committee, since there would not be the ability to do that on the House floor, and that kind of really slowed down and kind of gummed up the process, for lack of a better word.
Is Georgia Congressman John Lever still on the Rules Committee?
I'm sorry?
Georgia Congressman John Lever still on the Rules Committee?
Yes, and Congressman Tom Price has offered amendments, submitted amendments to the Rules Committee as well, and trying to address these issues. There is several congressmen from Kansas, a couple from Kansas and some other states have circulated dear colleagues that would explicitly move out the time constraints of the legislation. There's also real concern among the states over what would happen or what would be the safety net for the states should Congress not appropriate the funding to comply with the law. There is a real question about whether or not the funding for this type of legislation would make it through the appropriations process and stay in the appropriations bills, considering all the politics going on right now with all the appropriations measures in Congress. And that is one of the things that the National Governors Association and NCSL in particular have been harping on, which would be, should the bill pass as it is written today without the corresponding appropriations funding, it could be funded mandate to the states of really ultimately a couple of $1 billion. Real briefly, there was a committee hearing in the Senate Rules Committee, of which Senator Chambliss is a member, chaired by Senator Feinstein, to deal more generally with the issues of election reform and verified paper audit trail and these types of mandates and potential for legislation. Senator Feinstein said explicitly during the committee hearing that she thought the 2008 deadline was completely untenable, and that in her mind no legislation could be passed in Congress this year that would have that timeline. There was also some testimony from Doug Lewis from the Election Center in Houston, Texas, Judy Markowitz, the immediate past president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, and some others that really seemed to have shed some light for the committee members as to what these requirements would actually mean for the states. On the state legislative front, obviously the state legislature is out of session. Over the next several weeks, our office will be meeting with the Georgia Election Officials Association, legislative committees, local elections officials on some issues that may be brought forward or they may want to see addressed, some housekeeping issues. I know one in particular that was mentioned today that we need to be considered. So we hopefully by the next board meeting we'll have an idea of what may be presented in the legislative session in January. Additionally, we'll provide to the board an update as to what legislation is pending to be carried over to the next calendar year. There's one bill in particular that this board had heard or was briefed on in March, and that was Senate Bill 71, which was Senator Williams' bill to move all splost elections to 4 times during the year. That bill did not make it. It was passed in the Senate. In fact, it was included on 3 bills that passed out of the Senate. But none of those were able to pass out of the House. So that bill is still considered to be alive and up for consideration in the House. So I expect that will be debated and probably see some movement on it this coming year. That's about it for the legislative agenda. I'll answer any further questions or move to a very brief overview.
Are we preparing a list for our housekeeping legislation from 2008 session?
Yes. And hope to have that, at least some parameters for that by the next board meeting so that we can be able to move forward with what needs to be introduced or in January.